The year is 1643. On a cold morning in northern France, a young French commander looks through his spyglass and sees something that would make the bravest men in Europe tremble. He sees a forest of wood and steel. He sees perfect geometric squares bristling with 5-meter-long pikes, surrounded by clouds of black powder smoke. He sees the Spanish Tercios. For 150 years, this was the sight that signaled the end of a battle before it had even begun. From the sun-baked plains of Italy to the freezing mud of the Netherlands, the Spanish Tercio was not merely a military formation. It was a machine, a flawless engine of war that had crushed the French, broken the Dutch, and humiliated the Germans. They were the unconquered squares, a force so disciplined and so lethal that they were widely considered invincible. But on this day, at the Battle of Rocroi, the invincible is about to break. To understand how the greatest military dynasty in history collapsed in a single afternoon, we must first understand how they built a system that ruled the world for a century and a half. We have to look inside the machine. Warfare in the Middle Ages was defined by the chaotic charge of heavy knights. But as the 16th century dawned, Spain changed the equation. They realized that the future of war wasn't about individual glory, it was about geometry, ballistics, and collective discipline. They looked back to the ancient Greek phalanxes and the Roman legions, and they modernized them with the deadliest technology of the age, gunpowder. The result was the Tercio. Imagine standing on a battlefield in the 1500s. Across the field, you see a massive square block of 3,000 men moving as one single organism. At its heart was the pike square. These men carried ashwood pikes tipped with steel, ranging from 4 to 5 meters in length. When they lowered these pikes, they created an impenetrable hedge, a cactus of steel. A cavalry charge against this was suicide. The horses would refuse to run into the spikes, and any rider foolish enough to try would be skewered before he could swing his sword. But a wall of pikes is just a defensive shell. To win, you need to kill the enemy from a distance. Surrounding the pikes were the sleeves of the formation, the arquebus. These men carried the heavy, distinctively curved matchlock muskets known as arquebuses. In the early days, firearms were slow and clumsy, but the Spanish genius was in how they used them. They perfected the countermarch. The front row would fire a volley of lead into the enemy ranks. Then, with clockwork precision, they would turn and file to the back of the formation to reload. The next row would step up, aim, and fire. By the time the first row returned to the front, they were reloaded and ready. It was a rolling curtain of continuous fire, a perpetual machine gun centuries before the machine gun was invented. And if the enemy somehow survived the hail of bullets and tried to push through the pikes, the Tercio had a nasty surprise waiting in its belly. The rodilleros, swordsmen armed with steel shields and razor-sharp Toledo blades. They would slip underneath the locked pikes of the enemy, get in close where the long spears were useless, and butcher the opponents in tight quarters. This combined arms system was a revolution. It meant the Tercio could handle anything. Cavalry, form the square and lower pikes. Infantry, blast them with muskets. Artillery. The formation was so deep and morale so high they could absorb the losses and keep marching. For decades, this formula was the cheat code of European warfare. At the Battle of Rocroi in 1522, they slaughtered the Swiss mercenaries who had dominated Europe for a century. At Pavia in 1525, they captured the King of France himself. The Spanish soldier became the archetype of professionalism. They were often unpaid for months, starving and ragged, yet they possessed an esprit de corps, a brotherhood that was terrifying. To break rank was a shame worse than death. To surrender was unthinkable. Europe spent a century trying to solve the puzzle of the Tercio. Armies grew larger, cannons grew louder, but the Spanish square remained the immovable object. However, time is the one enemy that no formation can defeat. By the mid-17th century, the tectonic plates of warfare were shifting. The military revolution was accelerating. Muskets were becoming lighter and faster to load. Artillery was becoming more mobile. Cannons were no longer just heavy siege weapons, but field guns that could be moved quickly to blast holes in infantry lines. Innovative commanders, particularly Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden and later the French, began to realize that the tercio had a fatal flaw. It was too dense. A tercio was a massive block of humanity. It packed thousands of men into a tight space. This gave it incredible staying power, but it also meant that only the men in the very front rows could actually fight. A man standing in the 10th row of a pike square couldn't shoot his musket, and his pike couldn't reach the enemy. He was just waiting to step forward. The new school of war favored linear tactics. Instead of deep squares, armies began spreading out into long, thin lines, only 3 or 4 men deep. This maximized firepower. If you have 1,000 men in a line, every single one of them can fire their musket at the same time. If you have 1,000 men in a square, only the outer edge can shoot. The equation was simple. The thin line puts more lead in the air than the thick square, but the Spanish, proud and conservative, clung to the formation that had given them an empire. They believed that the weight and shock of the tercio would always smash through the flimsy lines of their enemies. They were wrong. And the bill came due at Rocroi. It is May 19th, 1643. The Spanish army is besieging the town of Rocroi near the border of Belgium. They are confident. Why wouldn't they be? They are the Spanish army. Facing them is a French relief force led by the Duke of Enghien, a brilliant tactician who is only 21 years old. The battle begins in the traditional way. The massive Spanish infantry squares take the center, flanked by cavalry on the wings. They look magnificent, formidable fortresses of pike and shot, waiting for the French to break themselves against the wall. But the young French commander doesn't play by the old rules. He knows he cannot attack the tercios head-on, so he ignores them. Instead, the French cavalry launches a ferocious, lightning-fast attack on the Spanish flanks. The Spanish cavalry, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, collapses. They flee the field. Suddenly, the battlefield goes quiet. The dust settles. The Spanish infantry, the legendary tercios, are still standing there. Their squares are perfect. Their discipline is unbroken, but they are alone. The French cavalry has swept behind them, and the French infantry is in front of them. They are surrounded. In the old days, a surrounded army would surrender, but these are the veterans of the Army of Flanders. They form a defensive posture, a last stand formation, bristling with pikes in all directions. The French commander, Enghien, respects them. He knows that charging into those pikes will cost him thousands of lives. So he brings up the artillery. This is the moment the age of the tercio truly dies. It doesn't die by the sword, it dies by mathematics. The French line up their captured cannons and point them at the dense, packed masses of Spanish troops. At close range, they open fire. The cannonballs plough through the Spanish ranks. Because the tercios are so deep, rank after rank of men, a single cannonball doesn't just kill one man, it tears through 10 or 20. It is a massacre. The density that was once their strength has become their death sentence. Gaps open in the lines, the dead pile up. But incredibly, the Spanish close the ranks. They tighten the square. They refuse to break. The French cavalry charges in to exploit the gaps. But the Spanish pikes come down and the muskets flare. Even while being slaughtered by artillery, they remain lethal. The battle drags on for hours. The French launch 3 massive assaults. 3 times they are repelled by the bleeding, battered but defiant Spanish squares. It is a display of grit that earns the admiration of the entire world. Finally, the Duke of Enghien offers terms of surrender. He signals that the Spanish may leave the field with their flags and their weapons, a rare honor of war, usually reserved for victors. The Spanish commander, waiting in the center of the carnage, supposedly replies with a line that has echoed through history. "We cannot. We are a Spanish tercio." But gallantry cannot stop cannonballs. Eventually, with their officers dead, their ammunition gone, and their formation reduced to a fraction of its size, the remnants of the Spanish army signal for quarter. When the French soldiers finally walk among the Spanish dead, they are struck by the positioning of the bodies. They lie in straight lines. They died in formation. They died as they lived, disciplined, orderly, and facing the enemy. The Battle of Rocroi was not the end of the war, nor did it instantly destroy the Spanish Empire, but the spell was broken. The psychological aura of invincibility that had protected Spain for 150 years evaporated in the smoke of Rocroi. The world saw that the giant could be killed. The lesson of the Tercios is a brutal one. It is the lesson of innovation versus stagnation. The Spanish perfected a system of war that was superior to anything else on earth, but they fell in love with their own creation. They perfected the past while their enemies were inventing the future. The Pike and Shot formation had dominated the Renaissance, but the era of the square was over. The era of firepower, of thin red lines and thundering artillery had begun. The Tercios walked off the field at Rocroi and into the pages of history, leaving behind a legacy of iron discipline that has rarely been equaled and never surpassed. History is defined by these turning points, where the old world collides with the new. If you want to explore more of these decisive battles and the strategies that shaped nations, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next documentary. And tell us below, do you believe the Spanish Tercio was the greatest infantry formation in history, or was it simply a giant waiting to fall? We will see you in the next chapter of the past.